Hello? Is the mic sound clear? I think so too. Okay. Thank you all for joining us tonight for our very first session of critical practice. We would also like to thank the school, especially Ava and Manijay, for having confidence in our initiative and sharing an enthusiasm for it. I am Arya Arabshahi, and together with Love DeMarco and Tobias Sensor Dausgaard, we have organized a series in search for a proactive mode of practice. The Critical Practice series is a call to reimagine the relationships between the profession and the network of actors and conditions that surround it. Together with architects, planners, and economists who are piloting new models for engaging with the public realm, we will have an open conversation about common challenges and exemplary initiatives. In discovering ways to have a more nuanced impact on the built environment, we unfold 3 themes that we believe have the potential to redefine the future role of the architect. Rethinking clients, which will happen tonight. Forms of alliance, which will happen exactly 2 weeks from today, so we'll see you there. And affording risk, which happens in term 2. So why did Le Corbusier play the double bass while presenting his proposal for the Palace of the Soviets in the picture? Or in other words, how can we break conventional boundaries in the way we approach clients? This discussion will focus on challenging the traditional client-architect relationship, as well as alternative economic models, investigating ways to include a wide range of stakeholders and a greater diversity of users. I will now hand the session over to Love DeMarco, who will introduce our guests and will chair this conversation. Thank you.
Hello. Hello, do you hear me? So hi and welcome everyone. My name is Love DeMarco, and I'm super happy to see so many of you were able to come tonight. So to kick this off straight away, it is my pleasure to introduce tonight's excellent speakers, who each in different ways, through their practice, reimagine the relationship between us as clients, us as architects and our clients. And we've asked each of them to present a project that establishes their position or attitude. And after this, we will open up the floor to further discussion and debate between the participants themselves and everyone else in the room. So at that point, please feel free to just jump in and we'll hand you a microphone straight away. So I'll start by introducing Peter Swinen on your left. So Peter Swinen works on the convergence of space production and spatial policy. In 1998, he founded 51 M4E space producers in Brussels. And between 2010 and 2015, Peter enrolled as Flemish state architect, a public mandate empowering architecture as a policy-making practice. He was my teacher here at the Architectural Association in 2015-16 and has been a guest professor at the ETH Zurich. And he's now a visiting professor at the University of Luxembourg. Since 2015, he practices and researches architectural policy whispering at CRIT. Next to Peter, we have Georgia Manolopoulou. Georgia is the founding partner of AY Architecture and professor of architecture and experimental practice at the Bartlett School of Architecture. Her projects include school buildings, public spaces, temporary buildings, exhibitions, and installations. Georgia co-curated the Irish Pavilion for the 2016 Venice Biennale and is the author of the book Architecture of Change, published in 2013, and founder and editor of the publication series Bartlett Design Research Folios. Then it's further my pleasure to introduce Martin Gielen. Martin is one of the founding members of the Brussels Space Collective Rotor, and is unit master for the Diploma 18 unit here at the AA. So Martin has previously taught at TU Delft and at Columbia University, and curated the 2013 Oslo Architecture Triennale Behind the Green Door. Roto curated the OMA Progress exhibition at the Barbican, as well as the Belgian Pavilion of the Venice Biennale of Architecture in 2010. In 2012, Roto developed an online inventory of salvaged building materials around Brussels called Opalis. And finally, I'm really happy to introduce Giles Smith. Giles is a founding member of the architecture collective Assemble, where he's been working on projects at a range of scales in Venice, Liverpool, and London, with clients including the University of the Arts London and Goldsmiths University. Giles teaches Intermediate Unit 7 here at the AA and has previously taught at the London School of Architecture and the University of Westminster. So let's put our hands together for our speakers tonight. Peter, I'll hand the word over to you.
Okay, thank you, Louvet. I just realized that I'm blocking the screen. So, yeah. Just indicate whether I should shift or not. And also, I mean, I was counting on that screen, so it's a smaller screen. So please, I mean, I'll try to read out what's on the screen as well. So it's called the unprivate client, and it's partially a speculation, something I've been working on for the last 22 years in practice, but also, let's say, for the last 2 years, also trying to write a certain theory about it. So this lecture in that sense, or this statement in that sense, hopefully could help the development of the concept of the unprivate client. You see here a very small booklet I just got 3 weeks ago from a friend of mine, Leo Streich from Something Fantastic. We're making a book together on the topic, and Leo was so kind to make me this booklet just to urge me to finish the text. So it's not finished yet, but let's try. And I'll read you the first paragraph of the text. Why? Because it's also linked to this space, this institute, and I think it could be interesting for the debate afterwards. So, and it starts with a quote by Mr. Gary, one I can comply with, one of the few maybe, but whether architecture is an art, if anything, architecture is the art of dealing with clients, which I think is kind of interesting. I have reached a point of no return. Speaking is Elias Zengelis, architect, 77 years old. The year is 2014, the venue, the Architectural Association London. Zengelis just delivered a 2-hour lecture, we're sitting there, on 45 years of architectural practice. The second tension between a wished-for architectural autonomy and the brutal reality of political and economical constraints is tangible throughout the whole lecture. A lamenting, almost wronged undertone seems unavoidable. During the closing Q&A, the relationship between the architect and the architectural client is brought to the fore, and how to keep a project alive despite clients. This question was asked by back then director Brad Steele. So how can you have an architectural project despite the client? As a reaction, Zengelis shrugged and then uttered, "I hate clients." The audience chuckled, but in a way, Zengelis was extremely serious. I said, "There is no way I can go back to designing for clients. I will never design a house for a client who wants an architect to do so unless there is a contract demanding the client to go to sleep and only wake up when the house is finished." Hilarity. Zengelis is deadly serious. As if at the end of his intriguing yet difficult career, he finally found the guts and even the gusto to kill off perhaps the most essential partner in architecture, the client. Zengelis ensues, "I know I'm telling horrible things, especially to students who have to learn to serve a client. But I'm incredibly allergic to this requirement. My clients are the students we work with, and together we define the brief. We do projects that are deemed to be unrealistic. However, they only are so under the present political conditions." And especially this last sentence, deeming that a project should be unrealistic under certain political conditions, that I find questionable and I want to challenge, and I'm actually also not agreeing with. I do think that to a certain extent, you can have, through architectural practice, you can have an effect on political conditions. And I'll try to show you this. First, some, let's say, historical examples where I intuitively feel that the client, and in this case, a deep blue client, a financially deep blue client, was actually unprivatized by the architect. So we have here Mies Johnson and Phyllis Lambert, who, for the sake of having a very slender, elegant building, actually made sure that the 1961 zoning requirements, or the zoning resolution of New York, got changed. So all of a sudden, public space became something which was inscribed or potentially favored through the zoning resolution in New York. This means that this project, beyond its architectural absolute elegance, actually managed to do something beyond the project itself. So it actually had an impact on policy, which I find the biggest quality of this project. Another example, much more maybe demure and soft in its approach, also soft in its financing, the Aldo van Eyck playgrounds, which he built over a period of 40 years in Amsterdam, more than 700 projects, and where I feel that he actually also managed to unprivatize the client, though this client was the city of Amsterdam, so it's a public client. But as you know, most of the public clients, they behave like private clients because there should be return on investment and all those things. So I feel here, and again, it has to be further developed, but by creating this long-lasting program, almost in an autistic way, Van Eyck managed to really unprivatize the city of Amsterdam. To be discussed. Another in the same kind of region, Lacaton-Vassal, 1996, the Bordeaux region, where they had commissioned to embellish this square. And they had a budget to do so, and they said, well, they asked the people around the square, they said the square is fine, and said, we're not doing anything. So the architect refused to actually design something. And on the contrary, they said, well, the budget which is available, let's keep it, and for the next decades, this will be the budget to actually just maintain the square, which I think, so doing nothing in a way. Also, I think as a strategy, in this case, again, to unprivatize a public client who thought maybe that every X years you have to embellish, you have to redo a square just to keep the people happy. So this idea of unprivate client, and the definition is not final yet, but so it's about either private or public funds. So in a way, it could be both or something in between, provoking a kind of maximized civil value or civil profit. This is not something new. At the same time, this is not happening as often enough, I think, at least in architectural practice. And just for the sake of this evening, I did a very quick test of 10 projects which were built from my former practice over a period of 10 years' time. I'm not going to explain the project, but I mean, very quickly, there's one where I know that we didn't manage to unprivatize the client, which in a way is a failure, and even two where I'm doubting at the moment. I think the other ones, but again, this is a lecture in its own right. But so I'm revisiting also the production of the last 15 years in that sense, personal production, to check whether we managed to be successful on the level of unprivatizing. And unprivatizing client also, of course, means maybe, or could mean the unprivate architect. But what does that mean, unprivate architect? I still feel today, and I'm making a voluntary kind of shortcut. I know I'll be lying, but you have this kind of fake choice if you leave school to either go in private practice, and I could have taken any kind of, this is Chris Kantenbein, but I could have taken any kind of office that features in Vogue or whatever, this kind of fountainhead-like fetishism of the private practice. On the other hand, you see here, this is from the study of AMO, Public Works, where they analyzed work of anonymous civil servants. So people in a way who have no name, but they design really powerful architecture within the public realm and for public service. So this too, I think there's something in the middle to be found. That's at least a speculation. And the way at the moment I'm trying to also develop this idea of the unprivate architect is through ghostwriting. So not putting your name under a project, which is new to me as well, I must admit. And the notion of policy whispering, so having an impact on political policy, which means by making an architecture project, not signing it, still being able to whisper it in somebody's political ear, and hopefully they listen. It's the same thing as doing a competition. I mean, it's the same kind of risk-taking. 1 out of 5 you win, or you get a kind of commission. And I'm going to show you one project, and the images are blurred, so it's not a fault in the, because it's under the radar, so I can't show you the image, or the project. But please bear with me, it's like a 2-minute explanation. This is a project which is still going on. It started 2 years ago, and it's for a city. Martin probably will know as we go along which city it is, but if you don't know Belgium, you don't know which city it is. Somewhere in the north of Belgium, they have a big river. They've been fighting or asking themselves for the last 100 years, should we have a bridge? I mean, it's the opposite of London in that sense. There's no connection between left and right bank. And instead of waiting for the next competition or whatever chance to, as an architect, to profile yourself, I decided to go straight to the biggest promoter with a model. Not this model, a very small model. Free of charge, knocked on the door, unannounced, said, well, I think we should make this. And by chance, he got intrigued. He commissioned us to, this is the client. He commissioned us to, and I hope if you zoom out too much that you don't recognize the client, because with the blurring, if you zoom out, you start to recognize people. That's a risk. And so we had a session of 3-4 months. Incredibly generous in a way to work out a project under the radar. So again, nothing official. Paid also, decently paid. This was at the office, and I put in this image, the arms raised, is potentially also out of despair, because actually we weren't supposed to make, let's say, a real architectural project, more kind of strategic project. And we were as lost as we were, or could have ever been, but I think it was a really interesting experience. So the idea was to whisper into the ear of the promoter, the developer, a project that he could do, of course, and then the promoter would whisper this into the ear of the mayor. That was the kind of strategy. Sketch. And then we made a huge, like a 3x3 model filling a whole room, which was had the intention for the developer to see the mayor for 5 minutes without the architects or without the designer, so we were not there. So it's kind of complete anonymous, because if we would have been there, knowing the mayor and knowing his political affiliation, the project would never go through. But even that, I think it's something interesting. And then this was done December 2017. 1 month later, and I'm sorry it's in Dutch, but it's a press clipping, an important one, saying that should city X get a bridge over river Y. And the party of the mayor put out this press clipping because we had elections coming up. So they're of course all kind of keen to communicate something. And they said that if we win, if we keep majority, this will be an election promise, which I think is something. So let's say from an unsolicited project to be able to get to this kind of written press clipping. And of course they won. So this is 3 weeks ago, 4 weeks ago. So at the moment, there will be a project. The strange things maybe about this kind of unprivate client. So we try to unprivatize the hardcore developer. Of course, he's in there for its own benefit. At the same time, I think shortcutting a lot of normal ways of either competition or whatever, or commissions, I think we gained some speed, and we were able to have, again, I mean, at the moment in Belgium, there's this big dilemma or even scandal that some mayors would see projects under the radar. I think it's common practice, luckily or unfortunately. So to make to have a kind of maximum, take a maximum advantage of that. We know for sure that we won't doing the final project, but preparing grounds. So, I mean, I think also that if you think about where architecture could go, should go, I think preparing grounds is a kind of niche, or not even a niche. I think it's a zone which is completely uncharted. So everybody's focused on the final product or trying to make a final project. I highly believe in preparing grounds, and then that means you're not putting a name under a project. At least you make sure that by making a shortcut, that after 100 years, actually a real project is happening. So in that sense, as a conclusion, the unprivate client becomes also with the unprivate architect. And definitions are still open at this stage, but hopefully this debate will help to fill in the gaps. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Julia,
Continue.
you want to go?
Okay.
Yep.
It is a privilege to be here, and thank you to you, Louv, and Tobias and Araya for inviting me. I'm here to talk as an architect and also as an academic. As a design practitioner, I run a small practice, AY Architects, and as a design tutor and researcher, I'm based at the Bartlett School of Architecture. In the first years of my academic career, and many times since then, I have been asked to write, to produce papers, refereed papers, to produce books. And this was the advice I was given when I became a lecturer back in 2003 at the Bartlett. It was required. I consider the study of text and writing part of one's architectural practice, and I like doing that. But I felt that that requirement took me out of practice, out of design practice, for a couple of years. I consider myself an architect who is primarily interested in design, whether this is interpretive, whether this is critical or propositional, and whether the work is drawn or built. And I think there are many, many individuals like me who might be in practice running their own design studios or in universities. What I would like to see more is to see my university and many architectural schools across in Europe and across the world to support us in this activity of design, and in this way to support our profession. And as I said, I'm sure I'm not alone in this. Many designers find themselves absorbed either by academic positions that do not let them practice in any meaningful way. And here I mean, again, design practice. And many of my very talented students, and perhaps there are people here in the audience, as they finish and they graduate, they end up in huge practices because they find it extremely hard to set up their own studios. And we all know the reasons, and the reasons tend to increase in the UK environment, but elsewhere, and in a very profit-driven city like London, and also other cities, of course. So the question for me tonight is, how can universities help architectural practices, particularly in their genesis, and how can they support the profession and directly the production of the built environment? I will show one project from my practice and how I have tried to advocate for our academic systems in my position at the Bartlett, hoping that that might resonate some kind of similarity with what other people might be doing. Between 2008 and 2012, while I was revisiting my PhD in order to write Architectures of Chance, I was also having a young family and was in the beginning of starting AY Architects with my partner, Anthony Boulanger. Disappointed by the competition avenue as one that can potentially lead to buildings, we looked at potential projects at our doorstep. Competitions are a fantastic mechanism, and in design studios, very, very, very important, and we still do them. The problem is that even the chances to win them are not high, and even if you win them, the likelihood of having your building being built is questionable. So disappointed. So this is this tiny building in our local neighborhood, which was totally unloved and falling into parts. And this is the interior of the building. It was a nursery and one with lovely people running it, very diverse, very affordable and informal, with a magical life pedagogic life in its interior, and a spectacular garden to the outside, with mature, tall trees that you very rarely have for an affordable nursery, and very diverse nursery in a city like London. And our kids were going to this nursery. We knew the staff, we knew the neighbors. So rather than continuing with competitions, which are likely to remain unbuilt, even if you win them, we had, at the time, I think, were second a couple of times on big international competitions, and we were very, very frustrated, as many of us have been there. So Anthony and I thought that we should try to do something for this nursery, which is just next to our house. So we galvanized the community, the local parents, neighbors. We fundraised. We did a feasibility study to prove how unsuitable the existing building was, and we managed to get government funding for a new small nursery in that locality. So we were neighbors, local parents, trustees of the nursery, clients therefore, architects, fundraisers. We have multiple roles in this. The building is very simple, and I'm going very quickly pass through a few of the images, although I think I'm blocking them. But the plan is very, very simple, and it's a small building, but it has a more complex geometry in its roof. This is so that it can accommodate north to south orientation, so that the interior of the building works very well as a space for playing and learning with daylight. So it has just that simple twist. And so what you see here are the strip roof windows which run diagonally to the plan of the building. And here you see the interior. So the geometry, materialized through a cross-laminated construction, brings good daylight deep into the plan during the winter months and blocks undesired light in the summer. So learning and playing in this building, in the interior of this building, feels like being outside. And the relation to the garden is seamless. So a series of vertical columns echo the trees of the garden outside. So I'll pass through this very quickly. That's the relationship that the building has to its public park. So it offers a long bench for common use that's not for use by the nursery, but for use by the local community. This is the entrance to the building. Again, I'm trying to show the relationship to its context. And this is the shared garden of the building, very much co-produced with local parents, with materials that were donated by the neighborhood and by the neighbors. So what is interesting for us in this building is the relationship to the park and its function as a pavilion to the landscape. This drawing that I'm showing here was done after the building was built, and the intention was to show the story of the building and the intention behind it in terms of how it should work with the park. What is interesting for us now, the building was realized in 2003, is that the building has initiated a number of actions, urban actions on the park. So the nearby playground has been upgraded, and the whole park feels much more loved for and cared for. But that's the positive side of this project. But what does a design excellence and an award-winning building do to its neighborhood? So on the positive side, we have the upgraded park and a new playground for the local community. On the negative side, operations had to be upgraded to match the quality of the building, the award-winning building. And our very lovely manager was fired because she wasn't a very good administrator, but she's fantastic with children. And the whole demographics around who attends the nursery now has totally changed. A new kind of parent body is now attracted to the well-designed building. Again, quotation marks. The nursery has gradually become far more organized, more ordered, more privileged, and less diverse. What has happened to our practice since then? I mean, I'm sorry I'm referring a little bit or entirely to my practice, but I think it's a personal story that can be common with others and other practices. What has happened since then, we have done bit by bit small other projects in the area. And they are tiny projects, but perhaps when you put them all together, they might have some meaningful influence in the community. So we've completed 6 school projects, 3 residential projects, and an urban landscape proposal, like this one, which, when we proposed a square, a public square in the center of Kentish Town. Some of these are realized, and some of these are unrealized projects, but for me they're very important. It's our commitment and involvement with that place, trying to to propose or to materialize ideas, and engaging with local neighborhood forums, the council, other designers, the community. So I think it's an important activity. This is another school project which we have just finished, a science lab for Eleanor Palmer. Very quickly, I'll pass through this. Camden School for Girls, which is almost finished, and some residential work where the Victorian typology becomes, it opens up into internal garden, an internal patio. Now, the main reason why I've presented this is because I wanted to show the role of my school and the potential role of the university in facilitating practices like mine and projects like the ones I have shown. The AA perhaps is a little bit different in this, but the Bartlett belongs to a research-led university, UCL, and typically refereed papers, chapters, and books would be the accepted form of research by a university. What I have argued, I took the role of director of research for a few years at the Bartlett, and what I tried to argue is that design practice must be seen as equally important to the practice of writing or study or history and theory. So we produced a number of folios so that the university could get financial results, because universities are funded by national research bodies. So that so projects like the Montpellier Community Nursery and many others, nearly 40 projects, were design projects. Some were drawings, some were buildings, some were urban proposals, and they were all submitted as research projects, and they were funded, and therefore the Bartlett and UCL was funded on the basis of these projects being seen as valuable production of knowledge and valuable research. What we did after that, we created the Bartlett Design Research Folios, which is an online platform which disseminates this work far beyond the national research mechanisms we have. So the projects are accessible online, and what is important for me is that this platform creates a link between university-led discussions and practice interests and direct links between the school and design studios. So when you go and click on any of these, you can click back to the person's practice, or you can click to other projects by the practice. This is a temporary project that I did as AY architects, and it was included also in our research outputs. Now, the word research, I think, is quite a dubious term, quite problematic, and I don't like myself very much using it, but we can use it creatively. We can use the university mechanisms in order to get support for design work. So universities are very much focused on teaching. I see practice, and I have put these pairs here. University in relationship to practice. Universities are focusing on teaching. I think the activity of learning is very fundamental in someone's architectural practice. So it is crazy to not bring the two together. Universities talk about study and research, and in architectural practice we experiment. We do live testing. Every building, in a sense, every proposal is a live experiment. Universities talk about knowledge production. Our focus is building production. The two are very, very close together. So there's a double contribution here. I think once the two come together, I think the contribution of a project is a contribution to the public, to the place where it is situated, but it's also a contribution to our discipline, to our architectural field. And I want to finish with this project, which is done by my unit, Unit 17, my students at the Bartlett. At the time, the project was run by my two teaching partners, Neil McLachlan and Michiko Sumi. The project was entirely student-led, fundraised by the students, built, designed and built. I'm not going to describe it in detail, but what is interesting is my partner, Neil, the following year, came up with the idea that something that is very much at the heart of our unit, but we said that the student is a protagonist in the production of architecture. And I want to take that idea a little bit further tonight and to say that the tutor is also a protagonist and an active practitioner and needs to be supported in that journey. And the university should be an advocate, an investor in architecture, a commissioner, a disseminator of architectural practice. And in this way, the university needs to do much more to innovate in the shaping of the city. Thank you.
Thank you. Martin?
Thanks. So, maybe, is this on? Yeah? Maybe at this point it's interesting to tell you what the brief was that we got. We got a brief to talk for 5 to 7 minutes, so I'll be sticking to the brief. As I seem to be the exception, I wanted to mention it. And also I won't be using images because, quite frankly, I think that there's a culture of image production in this school that is quite suffocating, and I decided to get out of the arms race with that regards. So this will be quite old school. I'll be looking at you, and I'll be telling you a few thoughts. And the first one is this quite problematic use of the term architecture, not just in the context of this lecture, but most in general. And I think it was quite well, or the problem, I became very aware of the problem just a few minutes ago, where we started referring to this group of people as us architects, supposing that it's a sort of a homogeneous field of competences, of demographics, of practices, and so on. So I think a number of things need to be said about this word architecture, and I don't think it's a word we should stop using at all, or I don't underestimate its value. I think that we are just linguistically confusing a number of things that architecture means. We can talk about it as a discipline, we can talk about it as a profession, which is not the same thing. We can talk about it as a degree. We can talk about it in many ways, but by mixing uncarefully these different meanings of architecture, basically you can conclude almost anything. Because architecture is everything that is built on the one side, but it's the 1% of projects that get published on the other side. And so these jumps in scales and relevance and so on make it very difficult to talk about architecture. So maybe to expand even further this notion of architecture, I realize that this is probably not helpful with regards to the first point that I was making. I think architects are omnipresent. I am active in the field of demolition quite recently, over the last few years. Every major demolition project is kind of managed by an architect. We just stop calling them architects when they start working for a demolition company. So that's a kind of a very strange thing to say that the field of architecture is super expensive and so on, but then when people become mayor, we don't call them architects anymore. When they become a demolition contractor, we don't call them architects anymore. The biggest architecture firm in Belgium, about 220 architects, is actually a sub company of the biggest supermarket chain. So they could actually say, well, we are the biggest architecture office in Belgium. We also sell some groceries. Then another kind of point that is worth mentioning is that, well, this sort of unique form of training that architecture supposedly is would generate a sort of a coherent field or a coherent set of ideas that all architects share. When we say that architects need to raise to power, have more influence on policy and so on, who are we talking about? Are we talking about Peter Swinnen, or are we talking about Patrick Schumacher, which also trained as an architect? What kind of architect do we think needs to be closer to power? Do we think needs to be more influential, and so on? I think also the place is very important. Talking about architecture in London and talking about architecture in Brussels is really not the same thing. Brussels is very, very small. We have really no problem of reaching politicians. I don't think there's a single good idea in our office that hasn't reached the right ears at the right moment. So I can imagine that in London this is not the case, but geographically there are differences within this field, and I think it's typically a problem of a former world power to think that the context that you are living here or that is present here must apply to the rest of the world. I don't think Kenya or China or wherever outside of the London metropole has the same problems as the ones that we are facing here. Something different, I refer to it as homo economicus. There's this idea that architects, more than any other profession, are kind of strapped down by the economic logics of their profession. It's like, we would like to do so many things, but economy, our relationship with the client, there's so many things that are holding us back because we are rational human beings and we only do what we are paid for. Well, if this would be the case, childcare would totally be a catastrophe. If you look at how elderly houses are organized, these people are not doing this for the money. They're not choosing the fastest track to the biggest career and so on. So why do we accept from architects that this economic argument is always the one that we should take into account? We accept of an office like OMA to say, we would love to do housing, there's just no money in it. Well, there's plenty of architects that are doing housing and social housing and so on. One last point on architecture in general is this scope of responsibility. If you do a facade in, let's say, natural stone, you're doing two things at the same time. You're digging a hole in a mountain of white marble in Carrara, Italy, and you're making a facade. One is considered an architectural project, the other one is not. It's a single action that we split up in two realms. One can be criticized, the other cannot be. And I think that, especially because materiality, those that are familiar with our practice at Rotor will know that this is kind of like a spear point of what we are talking about. This materiality, this transfer of materials from one side of the world to another really makes clear the very, very limited the very limited comprehension we have of the field of architecture. I have a few other points. I don't know how far I am in my 7 minutes.
You have about 1.5 left.
Okay, so I think competitions are highly problematic. I understand what they do in terms of renewal, new generations and so on, but I think that we need to understand that competition, especially a large one, provokes a surge, a sudden need for a lot more people in an office. When you lose a competition, you fire people. When you win a competition, you hire people. And this creates a sort of super Darwinian environment in which reflection and sharing of competences or building up a speciality as an office is very problematic. Rotor is organized as a co-op. We have 25 workers, 14 are shareholders. None of them are equal, have an equal amount of shares, but all shareholders have one single vote. So the acceptance of new projects is done by the shareholders, This makes that we are systematically looking for projects or venues or investments that do not force us to hire and fire people all the time, because basically we would be hiring or firing ourselves. Another point, and that's my last one, is that I think also when we speak about the problems that the world is facing, I think many of these problems, many of the key problems, are beyond the scale of architecture or even beyond the scale of urbanism. And I think this is something we need to be aware of. And it's a double thing, because it could be seen as a sort of a message of don't make yourself illusions, just go do whatever is easy and you like. I think we have a lot of leverage that we are not using. For instance, the construction budget in any given country is always like 10–20% of GDP. Architects are part of organizing some of these streams of the GDP. So if you, just by prescribing a certain form of local materials or whatever, you create jobs beyond the building site. Like, there's really very easy ways to have an impact beyond the building site. And that's just within my field of expertise, within my niche. We find that there are very big territories that are unexplored. So I just wanted to mention very quickly, but I think it has been elaborated on before. I think design as a form of research is a very, like, you could accept a commission for a client that you would normally not work for, because it gives you access to a certain way of thinking, a certain logic that you cannot understand if you are not on the inside. So we work with companies like Bouygues in France, or with companies like Prada, because there's no way to understand the economics behind it as long as you don't engage with these people. And then a very last point is also architecture as a form of memory, in a literal way, the buildings as a form of memory. But because it is such a slow profession, I think there is a sort of a potential for architecture to be used as a narrative device. Like, things have not always been like this. This presumption that there are no alternatives to the world that we are living today. Architecture kind of makes is very easy to mobilize to contradict these sort of statements. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, am I legible? People hear me?
Yeah.
I think Martin is going to like this. I'm just going to show loads of images, and I'm not going to say anything. Nothing of content, nothing you're going to walk away with. So I called my probably longer than 7-minute lecture after something that somebody once said in a documentary about us, and which has become a kind of catchphrase in our office about the way that we talk about ourselves, but is also about the way that we talk about our projects. So I called it "There is no boss," which is, this is a slow computer. So it both describes us as a practice. There isn't a boss. We operate as a collective, making decisions together, but also in the way that we aspire to work on projects. We aspire to work in a way collectively with co-conspirators, other bodies, governments, local governments, in order to make projects. I'm going to talk very briefly about a very old project, which I don't normally talk about, but it's helpful in kind of illuminating the way in which our practice came about. This is a cinema in a petrol station we made 8 years ago in London, and all the projects are in London, so it's helpful to talk about where they are. But the reason I guess I wanted to show it was because I think it's a really good example of a kind of amateur architectural practice, which is not one that we often talk about. And I think that it's interesting to me to talk about an amateur architectural practice because my friend and design theorist Stephen Knott talks about the amateur as a place where practice can revive itself. It can find new forms of working, new places, new kind of ways of doing things, because it sits outside of normal capitalist modes of operation. That the kind of inventor in their shed is able to do things that one is not able to normally do in the normal mode of practicing. And for us, this was kind of an amateur project. And so I don't think it is at all a model for how projects could or should be done. But for us, it was a space in which we invented a practice, in which we invented a way of working and a way of doing things, which was one where we treated the architectural project as a holistic project, from kind of conceiving of the project through kind of business development, through construction and running and organizational development, through to down to the kind of theatrics of pulling up this curtain every night with a kind of group of 16 of us. And so really, for me, it kind of formed what we call Assemble today. I'm going to talk about two other projects briefly within my time frame. The second of which is this project, which is Black Horse Workshop. This is in North London, Walthamstow. And it was kind of a complex hybrid in relation to how it kind of came about and how it's funded and who the client was. We developed this kind of idea for a kind of library of tools, something that was analogous to the library but was full of kind of things that somebody could use to operate in a kind of DIY manner, taking inspiration from the kind of men's shed movement. So the program originated with us. We kind of experimented with this idea, developed alliances with our local authority and with the GLA in order to produce this thing that became a kind of institution, a small institution. We kind of developed the organization, designed and built the building, and continue to be involved in the form of kind of having two Assemble members on the board of this kind of company as it kind of is ongoing. And it's this space for all kinds of people to make things, which is, as it happens, something that we think is a very important way of engaging with the world around you. And so people can go there, whether they are an amateur or whether they're a skilled professional, and make a piece of furniture. And it's just turned 4 and is home to all kinds of different practitioners and people who make things. And then the last project I wanted to talk about was something that we kind of started developing in 2011 in Stratford in East London. We were helped by what became the London Legacy Development Corporation, the public body responsible for the kind of aftermath of the Olympic site in East London, to find a space in the kind of hinterland of the Olympic Park. So this is it, and this is kind of what it looks like, which is slightly gross. This kind of old sign-making workshop where they used to make the kind of Wetherspoon signs about sausages and smoking. And we kind of took on this space, and we tried a kind of number of different things. We made pizza there and that kind of thing. But it evolved into a workspace through a kind of mixture of economic necessity and experimentation and relationship to our own practice. And on this site, we developed this building, part funded by the London Legacy Development Corporation, part funded by ourselves. It was kind of funded by the LLDC as a prototype for affordable workspace, new build affordable workspace on the Olympic site. And so we were trying to develop this thing that was super low build cost, but partly because we were also funding it and we had this relationship to it. And we were funding it with the idea that we would then kind of get the rental income. We developed a kind of system of, not system, sorry. We developed this material facade, these kind of cement tiles, built it all ourselves. This is a quick history of the building as it kind of evolves into a place that's kind of used and loved and full of tenants. Has this kind of one moment of exuberance, these kind of concrete tiles that open out onto a kind of yard, which became something of a kind of Instagram pilgrimage. I used not my words, somebody else's words. And then we sold it on an estate agent website and moved somewhere else because we were kicked off the site. And it used the process of having developed those projects in order to find a new home, a new place to practice, a new space in which to make things, do things, to work, and for other people to work alongside us. So it's 1,000 square meters, 50 tenants, all doing different things and working alongside and cooperatively with us. So that's me, thank you.
Thank you very much. Really interesting positions to start with. I'd like to take the opportunity to open discussion up to the rest of the room. If there are any immediate questions, otherwise I have a few in mind. Oscar?
Hello. Hi. Okay. Sorry. Hey. Thanks everybody. My question is kind of to do with the client's perspective, because notably there is no hard-nosed hyper-capitalist client sitting on the panel. I'm not having like a dig at the organizers, but because each of you seems to have somehow taken on the role of the client at some point, whether it's a form of self-initiation or if it's, you know, policy whispering or whatever it is. But I haven't heard the perspective, let's say, of the person who maybe isn't sympathetic to all of the problems and the pathologies of architecture. And I just kind of want to ask maybe each of you what you would think the really hardcore client would make of this discussion, whether they would have sympathy for it or whether actually we are having to, in effect, construct a new code to talk to them with almost like a secret agenda. So it's kind of like an open question. I just kind of want to know what you all thought about that. Thanks.
Does anyone feel?
Everyone's looking at me.
The last one.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I hope that in a way, to some extent, certainly some of the clients that we've had, more, I guess, traditional clients or hard-nosed clients, or however it was that you put it, might actually, I think, kind of see hope in the conversation that we've had, in as much as I think it's maybe more their language than we might expect, because clients aren't like, in a way, client is it's a problematic term, right? Because it others them, and actually, people who fund buildings and people who fund architecture and are involved in the kind of economics of how architecture comes about are interested in how architecture comes about. They are interested in this thing. They're interested in the same conversations that we're having, which are about, you know, how you fund it, how you make that money travel further, how you bring kind of different kinds of value into economies. And so I'd kind of question the premise of your question, which is that there's a kind of duality. There's like, you know, me, the like Mr. Nice Guy, like architect developer, you know, or kind of amateur architect developer, and then there's like the big bad client, you know, on the other end. And actually, I think that it's kind of a much more continuous conversation. And I think by embracing that, I think we can then better have a conversation with those people. I mean, sorry, hopefully now by kind of badly articulating an answer to that question, everyone else has had time to think about a good answer to your question.
I agree with him.
Yes. Oh yeah, Mike.
So it's just very strange because, like, one of the last WhatsApp emails that I received from one of the people in this table had to do with a client, and a client that actually we might find problematic in some way. It has to do with maybe BP or maybe Saudi Arabia and what we call problematic sources of funding. One of the most important questions that we have right now within the school is how do we establish lines, ethical lines between that money that comes through the doors when we actually are in a very dire need of financial support. So my question to you actually is that, supporting in what you were saying, I think there are very difficult clients that are not just that easy. So I would like maybe to ask, I don't know, if someone in the table wants to answer and take that question, where do we stand as architects? How many degrees of separation do we feel comfortable from problematic sources of funding? And when do we draw the line if we have the freedom to act as architects with our ideas and whatnot? So just dropping that in there.
So I recently sent a message to someone that is in the room about not accepting a commission for the Chicago Architecture Biennale, Triennale, on the basis that their main sponsor is British Petroleum. And the exact answer that I got, now you're making me blush. Anyway, it was a sort of the insinuation was that there was a form of opportunism in turning down this commission. And I think this is a very valid point, and I think it's so valid that we should maybe even embrace it as a sort of a strategy. Let me explain that. If you are some sort of bio yogurt producer, you cannot afford to kill your market by having some form of I don't know, OGM found in your yogurt. It would just kill your market from one day to the other. However, if you are like the cheapest supermarket brand that really puts forward its price, people are kind of expecting you to do things that they'd rather not know about. And so I think as architects, we can choose what sort of clientele we favor. Our clientele would not appreciate us working with BP, even if it passes through the hands of the Chicago Triennale. And I think so, yes, there is a form of opportunism in us turning down this commission. I also personally think that turning down commissions as a form of protest, you can only do it when you scream about it. Otherwise, it's not a form of protest. So I think it's sort of not only developing markets, alternative markets that are in a way more ethical than average. I think not only it's something you need to do for your own practice, but I think it's also something you need to do very vocally to make it harder for others not to do it. And that's the position we took on this particular case.
At the same time, I think, sorry.
No, go on and I'll
At the same time, I think there's a potential danger of some moralism sneaking into contemporary architecture, be it at school, in profession, or whatever. I mean, nothing withholds you, to screen your client. So, for instance, the former office, we worked in Albania. The first thing we did was screen the client, and of course, then you're not sure either, but still you have some kind of first reassurance. So nothing is withholding you to do this. I think it's also something ethical. But there is some kind of danger for kind of pseudo-moralism. For instance, I find it a pity that you don't accept the Chicago Biennial because you're, as an office, smart enough to find a crack in the system to be extremely critical. And saying no to it could be an option, but I think there are also even much more interesting options that are now not addressed. I mean, it's not about either or, but I mean, and also saying, well, because it's BP, yes, I understand. At the same time, I think it's a missed opportunity if Rotter doesn't accept this this invitation. So again, I showed it at the beginning. Seagram. I mean, Mies would have said no to Seagram because it's actually not ethical. I think as a company, but nevertheless, with this huge amount of money, they succeeded, I think, to do something much bigger or much more important than the architectural project. They had an impact on the city. Whether having private public space as a kind of I mean, there are good and bad examples, so it's not a holy principle. But still, I find it interesting if you could use certain critical masses, for instance, of budgets, private budgets, to do something beyond the architectural project and use the architectural project as a means to have an impact on civil society. And if, let's say, the architect or whatever, or the designer at the table is smart enough, I think there's still a completely uncharted field to be discovered by the architecture discipline. And I personally, I mean, I just moved schools. I went into Luxembourg, so that's a pretty hardcore environment, and with a very clear scenario and agenda in mind. So I can tell you about it this maybe in 3 years' time, if I can come back. It's not as black and white as it's projected. And again, I think vis-à-vis students, I think it's hugely dangerous to say, well, if there's big money involved or whatever, we don't do it. Please nuance.
I would agree to this, that it's not black and white. And I'll try to answer to, I think there are two questions here. The first is the first focus is on the hardcore client, the other on the hardcore funder, potential funder. So for the client, I'll answer in relationship to my practice. After and give an example. So after we finished this nursery in the Montpellier Community Nursery, we have repeatedly been approached by companies. They're coming from the US who are interested in a new series of hundreds of nurseries that will take over the world. They will take over the UK. They will take over Europe. Very focused on branding. The reality is, we say no to this kind of jobs, but I think they also say no to us. So it's becoming very clear that after our first conversations, that these clients would not like AY architects to work with, and we will not like them. So in a way, it's not black and white. We may need the projects. We know that they are not right, and actually we cannot even convince them to change their minds. So it's a both, they reject us, we reject them. So it's a two-way process. On the case of the funding, my experience from UCL is quite interesting, and maybe it's my personal interpretation. There have been very important cases of financial support from sources that could be called unethical. And I think that's my own interpretation. I'm not 100% sure, but I think I pretty much know quite well that place by now. I think UCL and the Bartlett's approach is quite interesting, because I would say in many cases the Bartlett will accept the money, but will make the issue of ethics an academic and research subject in its own right. So it will both accept it and scrutinize it. So maybe it replies to your point of actually saying yes, and then scrutinize the subject from many different points of view, academic, research, intellectual, ethical. And so I know examples where colleagues had strong disagreements about accepting money from certain sources, and UCL's position, or the faculty's position, was to fund these researchers to do further research on it. But this didn't stop them from accepting the funds. So accepting and scrutinizing at the same time.
But I think that in the end, you know, it's about estimating when you get into a commission what sort of power relationship you're going to be in with. And through the Chicago Architecture Biennale, you cannot start a meaningful conversation with British Petroleum. Like, there's no way you can be in a powerful position to change, like, even the color of one of their gas stations. Right? There's no form of dialogue. And so I would argue that actually we made a contribution to the Chicago Biennale or Triennale. Somebody should help me on that. That's our contribution, and it was actually quite funny because it was shared all over, and so all of a sudden you have like small Hungarian offices that share that message that we wrote saying, we will also not participate. And it's kind of funny because they were not invited, and actually we were. So it's kind of nice to sometimes also sometimes.
That's a good move. If they're not invited, saying that they won't participate, I think that's
a very good move. But I don't even think it would have been an important commission for us. So sometimes saying no in a very vocal way is just it is the project. It is what you're saying.
Imagine, Martin, it would be an extremely important commission for you, and you would say no, which you probably will do. But
we say no to almost everything.
Sure. Like a really extremely important. What could it be? You know?
Like the Venice Biennale, maybe. I don't know. I think it's also at least say no the first time. You know, then at least when they come back, you can. I think there's this typical economy of architecture offices, and then I'll pass the word. There's this typical economy where the offices are constantly looking for more work. We are not looking for more work. We typically hire less people than we actually need. So we're constantly overbooked, and we have this deconstruction company, which is hugely labor intensive. So if anybody's bored, you can always go clean tiles. You know, it's really not a problem.
Send some projects to us.
And but you can come clean tiles if you want. That's not an issue. So we have a sort of a reserve of work, and so typically we don't feel like getting more work. We're okay. So, and that's a situation that you can create if you don't want to grow as an office.
Thank you. I think we have a question at the back.
Hi, I'm Catherine. I'd like to ask a question following on the comments you've made. So regarding the fact that you should take the money but scrutinize, one thing that I find complicated to accept is that if you scrutinize and understand that the money is coming from a source you're not agreeing with, further on, what happens if, for example, every architectural practice or every body that would be a potential receiver of that funding would mobilize themselves collectively? What would happen then? Because we need to understand that if one or a minority of firms or groups refuse that money and try to act vocally, it'll try and pass on a message, but at the end it's the collective action that matters, right?
My answer on accepting and scrutinizing had to do with the academic environment in particular, not the architectural practice, because the academic environment has many different voices, many different researchers. And I think UCL's approach, and perhaps other universities do the same, are responding to the differences, to the different researchers, to the different academics. So some do want the money because the research they decide that that's okay, and others have a problem with, and with that. And UCL is supporting both communities, those who want the funds and those who question the funds. The UCL enables them to practice what they want. I don't, personally, in practice, I would find the biggest, for me, the biggest issue that relates to ethics is, that has happened to AY architects and probably other practices, is when we are asked to work for free, I find, or to participate in, sorry, I'm changing a little bit the subject, but I think it's different between the architectural practice and the university. They're two different animals. When organizations like the BBC or very visible public organizations would approach you to make a film or to produce a project, and everybody in that arrangement of actors will be paid and will be covered, but the architect does not need to be paid, because the architect is is gaining promotion, for example. I think that undermines our discipline. So I would say no to something like that, for example.
Thank you. I think we have another question over here, and then over here.
Maybe this is changing the subject slightly, but I wanted to ask a question which maybe bridges the 2 points that you, Yuria, and Peter made. So you told us about the students as a protagonist and maybe the university as a commissioner or an advocate. I mean, I find that very fascinating. And how can that relate to practice? How can students, or even graduates, how can the university relate to graduates, the recent graduates, and advocate them? And Peter told us about the, let's say, unsolicited project procurement, knocking on doors which haven't asked you to knock on their doors. So I wanted to hear your thoughts on maybe bringing these two, or merging these two ideas of, do you see a potential for universities to give a mandate to their graduates, to the students, to knock on doors and use the credibility of the school to propose something to people who have not maybe thought about them as designers?
I think universities do very, very little. And the examples I showed, they have been successful because of extreme kind of will and going against the grain and volunteerism by the students, by the tutors. I don't think universities do enough in this area at all. So the point I was trying to make is I want to argue for universities to do more, and I think there's an interesting financial model for them, potentially. I'm not an economist and I cannot figure it out, but I think there must be a way of both supporting the production of architectural knowledge through supporting architectural practice, and at the same time offering education. So I think we are perhaps in the beginning of this, and maybe the crisis we have in education and in professional practice might force universities to think about the role in a different way. But I'd like to see universities and architecture schools to be investing in good designs and good buildings, and to be supporting their tutors and their students in this. Up to now, what the Bartlett has done is to support us, photograph our buildings very well, or give us a little bit of a few funds to do models and drawings. It does very little. I think it's important, but it's just tiny. I think much more has to be done.
My take on architectural education, in that sense, is maybe very limited. In the sense that I believe that from a certain age onwards, let's say third year, students are perfectly able to work in or within real projects. And for me, real projects are projects, political projects, or policy whispering projects, so where you could have an impact on future policy. Which means that they still have the freedom to be very inventive. At the same time, they also start to understand that the idea of what I said earlier, preparing grounds, is an extremely important part of the job, at least of an architect. I don't believe in accepting a brief and then executing the brief. I think we have to work, and this is not a novelty, but upstream, so as soon as possible. And I mean, I also taught here 3 years ago. This is something we tried to install, although it was still very rocky. But for instance, in Luxembourg, we're doing this rather hardcore, may I say, with a real political program for aiming towards a near future Bauausstellung. Even hoping that, and that's my hope, that students can actually continue within the process and maybe have real commissions coming out of it, or doing supervising or whatever. So I do believe in the intimate relationship between education and then going to a certain market condition, because it's always everything, even if you're as ethical as you think you are, you're still operating within a market condition. And this kind of continuum from education towards, let's say, the start of practice, I think this is completely lacking all over. Not here, Belgium, wherever you teach. Just did 2 years ETH. I mean, I've never encountered such a kind of island condition, which is of course fantastic. At the same time, it's also very brutal once you start to leave school. And it's perfectly possible to have this kind of almost intimate relationships with maybe powers that be. And then it's up to individuals to be as ethical as possible. But again, you're not holy, so I think you have to, as you go along, each time check whether something is defendable or not. That's part of the practice as well.
Thank you. I think we have another question from the audience.
No, it's more like a reaction to other questions. I'm an architect, but I also went to Sciences Po in Paris, which is a political science school. They have a really interesting model. For example, their fees, you pay the fees regarding what's your parents' income. So I think it's a really interesting economical model for a school. And so it means like if your parents don't have so much money, you don't pay that much, which I think it's a really fair system. And the other point that I really like with that school is they, for like 10 years right now, implemented professional units, which means like you have your course, but when doing your course, you have the school make partnership with I don't know, consultancy office, big industrial, municipalities, regions. They hire clients, and for every year they propose like 10 research projects. So it means like as a student, you are in a group of 10 and you're working in a professional condition. The client trusts you as a normal client, and then the tickets start from 10,000 euros to like 50,000 euros. So this kind of system also helps to compensate the lack of fees from like kind of poor students, let's say. But it's really interesting because suddenly you're in 4th year or 5th year, and you're working as a professional. So it means, for example, you can work for EDF, which is a big energy provider. They ask you for consultancy studies, and then you go every month to a big tower in La Défense, and you suddenly see like what's a client, what's EDF, and also what's like a professional context. So you dressed up to go to these meetings, you prepare to go to these meetings, and you really work for them. And it's like between 6 and 9 months, and sometimes it's most of the case it stays studies, but sometimes it just go to a project. So for example, when I was there, we did a project in Arcueil, so a small municipality around Paris. It went really well, and 2 years after, we are still working with them to develop like developments by the inhabitants. So I think it's also really important to look out of the architectural realm to see that these kind of things already exist, and we can pick up a lot of good things all around.
I would like to react immediately, if you allow me. We have this great system in Belgium. It's called public funding, public education. You don't pay for school, maybe a few €100. That's really, really something you should look into. I mean, and then the school can make partnerships with companies, of course, and they do it on an equal basis. They don't have to force students to accept conditions that they would not accept as young professionals. They do not cannibalize the market of the young professionals that they put on the market. I think what you're describing is really a totally horrible model. I think a student should always have the possibility of refusing the brief, of contradicting the brief, and I do not think this is possible in a situation where the school is receiving money from a private partner.
I don't think it's. I don't think because it's public, it's good. First of all, I think we're also living kind of phantasm of the public good, really. And if you look at the history of public-private partnership, it's always been, as you say, cannibalized by the private. But it's just like, I mean, it's the way it's going. I mean,
I'm saying
the
the
fallacy of
school
the
is
public as
cannibalizing
a
the
good
market.
thing, I think it doesn't really exist. And it's never really exist, actually. So if you...
I'm saying that inscription money in schools should be as low as possible and should be state covered. That's one. I secondly say that schools should not cannibalize the market for the young professionals that they deliver. Meaning that if a student finishes school, probably these low competition, low-hanging fruit kind of things are the things that they will be looking for. If the school takes over that market by kind of selling the work of their student, that means that that work no longer exists for the professionals that they put on the market. And so yeah.
Can I? Oh.
I was going to say, I think it's kind of an important conversation to have in the context of London and the UK, because actually in architectural education, they're beginning to adopt these models of like the practice-led or practice-focused education, and it's becoming a kind of fashion. Like there's lots of institutions, not this one, which is, I guess, slightly different to others, but are seeking some way of, I guess, doing what they would see as kind of collapsing the division between practice and education. And I think actually Martin's criticism is very apt for that. And in my experience of the ones that I've seen, it does create problems, and it's, there are virtues to it for sure, but it does create problems in as much as you have a kind of the space in which you are liberated to kind of think and dream and like really push the possibilities of who you are as a designer, but also your relationship to the world, is limited by the framework of the practice that is you're involved with and kind of mentoring you or structuring your education. And in the context of architecture, I think that's quite problematic.
Well, I don't think it's an either-or question, to be honest.
Sure.
I think if it's one of the options available in the whole scope of a school, I think it could be, and then it's, of course, it's your choice. It's a free choice also of a student to go there. But again, the imagination is a fantastic thing, but don't over-exaggerate also the impact of it. A student can perfectly blossom when restrictions, or even if ethical restrictions are projected onto him or her, and something fantastic may come out of it. And maybe he or she learns to say no in a very intelligent way during the education. So I'm a bit uncomfortable with the very black and white type of discussion. I think it's much more nuanced. Again, if I would look at the AA and Eva, I hope in the near future that these kind of possibilities would be present. Or for instance, the fact that some students who are interested in after 5 years of hard study, expensive study, are willing to linger a bit longer or being linked to the AA, that there is some kind of facility offered in some way or another to be discussed. Because, I mean, just to give you one example of my, in Brussels, so the architecture school in Brussels, which is nothing compared to this or to all the other bigger institutes, but very dear to me. And we're trying now at the moment, so 5 students who recently graduated, who almost pro bono for the last 5 months have worked on a project which is actually linked to the school because it's actually reconsidering the actual school building, although the dean and vice dean are not saying yes, we just go ahead because we think it's necessary to have a building which actually, it's in a very, very harsh neighborhood, and at the moment it's a kind of, it's a complete ruin, so I think it has to be much more responsive to the neighborhood, which means also that the infrastructure has to be to a certain, I mean, has to have a certain level. So with the students in a kind of very proactive way, and they just made a huge model. Next Thursday we're going to present it to the dean and vice dean. And my agenda for them in a way, and maybe slightly patronizing, but is that they will get a commission to do this building as a kind of first thing when they come out of school. So no competition, I mean, no democratic thing, because there are 5 really interesting students. They said yes to work on it pro bono, which already is a first selection. I mean, and this is of course a one-off, but imagine if all schools would foresee these kind of programs, whether they could be massively economic or extremely idealistic. I mean, I don't care, to be honest, as long as there's a range available and that there's a choice available. And at the moment, I dread a bit the fact that schools still have a very naive position vis-à-vis what's going to come after the school. I mean, again, we can think of 100 types of practices of architecture that you could start to venture into, but still the way education is led, I'm not talking about this school as such, but I'm not aware at the moment how the school is organized, but I've witnessed a couple of schools in the recent past, and I think it's purely criminal to allow for students to be so naive in a way. I mean, it's nice for them to have this moment. At the same time, I don't think in this present condition that you can continue on having an educational system on that kind of almost unethical level. Because at a certain point you have to engage with reality or with community or with economy. So, yeah.
Thank you. I
Okay.
think there's a question from the audience and then a response from Georgia.
Do you want the question or the response first?
Perhaps a question first and then
Okay.
a response, if that's okay.
Go.
I'm the question and the response at the same time?
Should I give my response
Yes.
because it relates to the previous
Okay, yeah,
to this
absolutely.
discussion?
Yes.
And it has to do, I think, with the kind of the extent, the attention that the institutions and the architecture schools are paying on the role of the student and the student's relationship to practice. I think it's a little bit, it has been over-discussed, over-exaggerated, and to an extent it deviates from another issue. I think what schools would need to do more, in my opinion, is to support tutors. If the architecture school or the university supports design tutors and supports design practice so that the practice continues to innovate, I think we are making far more progress in how we progress our discipline. I think I would say that whether the students are linked to practice or whether they stay in their own world. I mean, personally, I think the division between architectural education and architectural practice, or some form of division, is positive. I do think that I do see students as practitioners in some sense, but I do like the fact that they can construct projects in their own terms rather than under a particular practice. I find that relationship quite dangerous. But if the architecture school supports the teaching agendas and the tutors and supports them to continue to practice rather than only be in academics without involved in design practice, continue to support the projects all the time and through research funding, then I think we are somewhere different because we both support practice and teaching.
Thank you. I think we have time for just one last question, and then I think it's time to run it up.
So, is my voice fine?
Yes.
It's funny, this school was created as a reaction of professionalization of education in a time in which architects could only gain a degree by actually working with someone. And those architects, right, an 18-year-old and a 23-year-old, they realized that they needed to find a safe space in which ideas could redefine the way in which architecture was practiced, defined, and so forth. So somehow this school has always been that space in which architectural practice is to be questioned and redefined. That is not to say that as part of the unit collection that we do have, we actually do have one unit that is doing a project in Paris that is a real competition in which people are going to be engaging with a total realistic context without submitting the competition on anyone participating, but as a way to actually give someone the possibility of the experience as an educational framework to actually understand that reality, that is a social, political, economical context that I think is part of what is that we need to do as a school. But still, I think the proportion of that space of radical reinvention is what defines and constitutes the essence of this place. Now, on Thursday, we have a conversation in this very same room with alumni, with people who graduated. And somehow I also invite everyone in this room because everyone in some future will be part of that. And when we just came down, like, what did we talk at the corridor, right? We just said, that membership room, I want to make it an incubator, a laboratory, a space in which when people just graduate can start organizing themselves among themselves or with collaboration with other individuals to start producing forms of practice that do not require of the usual client government competition framework. So the answer is yes to all those things. And yet the idea of like, how does a school allow and facilitate the idea of practice for their academic staff beyond the space of the studio and the unit? I think that's a very interesting question and one that has not been problematized enough and questioned enough. Today I was asking someone, I said, did every single unit studio always have a space? And they said, there was a time in which the offices of the unit tutors were inside the unit teaching spaces, right? The office and the unit space was one and the same. Then everyone lost their space, then, and so on and so forth. So I think there is a conflation of those two spaces, but I like to think that this room, in a certain way, should be also is a form of practice. No? And debates, discussions, lectures have become a form of practice. But so it's, and this is just a form to somehow not ask a question, but to actually respond to some of those issues. I actually find it highly problematic that when one receives problematic sources of funding, one moreover has to spend the time of doing the research on that problematic source of funding, because this is like Andy Warhol. I want people to talk about me even if badly, no? Like you keep on perpetuating the presence. So if you have problematic sources of funding, give them to me as long as I'm free. I'm going to actually make sure that I have a very clear, like blinding wall so that I can use that funding to really do what I think we should be doing with that. But I think that that's, for me, a very interesting conversation that is not on the clients, that is maybe on like capital, that and I don't think should jeopardize this panel. But maybe that's what we will do over drinks later on when that continues.
Thank you. I think on that note that we're reaching the end of tonight's conversation. It's a conversation that we could keep on having, that I hope that we will keep on having. I'd just like to thank Giles, Martin, Georgia, and Peter for being here tonight, and thank all of you for coming and listening and asking questions. I also want to remind you that tonight was the first in a series of 3 conversations. The next one is exactly in 2 weeks from now, where we're welcoming Finn Williams and Pooja Agarwal, Arno Brandeluber, and Freek Persson to join the table on the conversation of alliances. So please join me in thanking the panel, and I wish you a wonderful evening. Thank you.